Hello everybody, welcome back. We're now in our sixth presentation of this 8-part series. We have been talking a lot lately about the idea of a covenant theology. And now we're going to, the different sessions, we've worked the dignity of individuals in the family and community, economics and politics, all into this notion of covenant theology and how the covenant theology emerges out of the relationship between God and the individual, but it covers the relationship between individuals and mandates that the responsibility of people entering into this covenant to establish a just social order. And part of establishing a just social order is the ideal of peace. And so we're going to talk tonight about the role of war and peace in the defense and expansion of liberty. And obviously, as we talked about in the first session, when the first settlers came over here, one of their goals, obviously, they wanted to establish this city on a hill, this experiment in ordered liberty, and obviously they wanted to defend their liberty that they were establishing. But their vision wasn't simply to defend their own liberty, but it was to expand this idea, the idea itself, elsewhere. And they had, in this famous sermon, The City on a Hill, they were talking about we shall be a city on a hill and a light unto all the nations. The Declaration of Independence, the very beginning of it, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one body of people to sever the bonds that lead them to another, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind mandate that we declare, why we're doing this. Now, the respect for the opinions of mankind was, yes, it was a courtesy, but part of their objective in writing the Declaration of Independence is to make a statement of principle to the world, because they wanted to influence the thinking of the world in, positively towards these views. So there's, on one hand, you have the defense of liberty and then the attempt to expand it. On the other hand, you have the part of this notion of the covenant-related social justice, or justice in a society, is the establishment of peace. So sometimes these things come into tension, and that's what we're going to talk about, is how these things played out, the defense of, liberty and peace, the relationship between liberty and peace, which they saw as an insoluble bond. You can't have one without the other, because liberty is part of justice, and peace is part of justice, and it's all part of the same reality. So, peace without liberty is not possible. And sometimes the expansion and the defense of liberty and the establishment of peace created tensions. And the first example of this tension I want to talk about as an example that I've talked about several times, and I've talked about the Quakers of the Pennsylvania colony and how they had established a society that was run almost totally on the inner light and brotherly love. Almost no government, complete laissez-faire, no taxes, no regulation, no government for an extended period of time. Then what little government they did have once in a while was because their charter mandated it, but for most of the time they didn't meet, so it's for all practical purposes they had no government. And as I mentioned, in several areas this worked pretty well. Now tonight we're going to talk about, starting off, the area in which it did not work, and that is the defense of the people against attack from hostile Indians. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Indians were not one monolithic entity. Were they peaceful and friendly towards us, or were they hostile? Yes and no. They were both. Some of them were, peaceful, some of them were not. There was a diverse bunch of tribes, and they had various different responses, and even the same tribe might have been peaceful in one time and not so peaceful in the other. Now, the Quakers were pacifist. They took very seriously the Sermon on the Mount, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek. All these verses in the Sermon on the Mount that pacifists quote to support their pacifism, the Quakers took very seriously. And some people criticize the Quakers as being naive in that they didn't recognize the dark side of human nature, that they had too rosy of a view of human nature. That's not really true, and in order to understand their pacifism, I want to go back to what their views really were and how this led to pacifism. They did not misunderstand human nature. They understood that human nature was fallen, but they believed that the power of the inner light of the Christ dwelling within you was capable of overcoming the falling aspect of human nature. And they had this apocalyptic theology that they believed they were living in the end times. And the end times, is, some of you may know, means the last days, the coming of God's kingdom, the second coming, and all that. They believed that they were living in the end times, but they interpreted a lot of the apocalyptic verses in the Bible, the battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. They're not looking in terms of us versus them. These are the forces of light and these are the forces of darkness, and there's an external battle going on between them. Their interpretation is that this battle was going on in the heart and soul of each individual. And that the victory is not some military victory where Christ is going to lead these armies against the forces of evil. It is a victory of Christ within you that's overcoming that fallen human nature. So it is not that they misunderstood human nature. It's that their vision that they were living in the end times and they were called by God to realize the power of the inner light within you led them to believe that the victory over the forces of evil, which goes through each individual, is going to happen in their day and age. And all human beings, regardless of their religious affiliation or lack thereof, are capable of receiving the inner light of Christ within you. So it didn't matter to them if someone came from a Christian background or not. Indians, whatever, they're all human beings, and they're all susceptible to this, to this conflict that's going on within you. And so they didn't see this as an us versus them, and so they believe that by preaching this inner light and by showing brotherly love and all these other things, that this struggle between light and darkness is going on within each individual, and it was going to be resolved within each individual, that they could resolve that. And so when the William Penn set up his colony in Pennsylvania, they did not expropriate the land from the Indians. They bought it. And they had very good relations with them. They treated them very well, and there was conversions. And or even when they weren't converted, the relationship was actually quite well for a while. And they believed that this was going to, continue on in perpetuality, be the norm. As their colony started getting bigger and expanding out beyond just the city of Philadelphia, and they're running up against some different tribes, but also some of the same tribes. And there started to have tension and warfare on the frontier. And so some of the new people coming in, who weren't necessarily Quakers, were talking to the leaders of the community and said, we need some protection. But they refused to create a force that would protect the frontier because they were pacifists and they didn't believe in that. They didn't believe in the use of force in any shape, manner, or form whatsoever. So that was an incompatible way of dealing, in terms of a godly way of dealing with human relationships. So there was this quandary, and eventually that issue is what led to the Quakers withdrawing from running or not running or whatever, and withdrawing and becoming, kind of insulated. And they still were involved with a lot of social things. So like the Quakers were the first ones behind the abolitionist movement, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But in terms of running the colony, they didn't do so anymore. They gave it up, and that was the issue that finally did away with their rule.